Everyone at Damien Cross's wedding believed the bride was the biggest joke the Cross family had ever played on itself. Damien was the most feared, most spoiled heir in New York's underworld. A man who could have married into any of the 5 families with a single phone call. Instead, he'd chosen a quiet, plainly dressed woman nobody in that ballroom recognized. Nobody had vetted her. Nobody could find a single photo of her online. They laughed behind their champagne glasses. They whispered that Damien had lost a bet, or a bargain, or maybe just his mind. What none of them knew, least of all Damien himself, was that the woman standing beside him at that altar wasn't marrying beneath her station at all. She was marrying down in every way that mattered. And the moment he discovered exactly who she really was, the entire foundation of his family's empire would shake harder than any rival had ever managed to shake it. 3 months earlier, Damien Cross had been, by every account that mattered in his world, insufferable. He was 31 years old, the only son of Antonio Cross, and he'd spent the better part of a decade coasting on a name he hadn't earned and a fortune he hadn't built. He drove cars he wrecked and replaced without blinking. He canceled meetings the moment they bored him. He'd been engaged twice before, both times to women from rival families, and both engagements had ended in public, humiliating collapses that his father had spent considerable money and effort quietly burying. Antonio Cross was tired. Not angry. Antonio had stopped being angry at his son years ago, the way a man stops being angry at whether he can no longer control. Just tired. Running out of time. And increasingly certain that the empire he'd spent 40 years building would not survive being handed to a man who had never once, in 31 years, been forced to want something he couldn't simply demand. "You will marry within the year," Antonio told him one night over dinner, in a study that smelled of cigars and old money. "Someone I choose or someone you choose. I no longer care which. But you will marry, and you will start acting like a man who intends to keep what I built, instead of gambling it away one wrecked car at a time." Damien laughed at first. Then he saw his father's face, gray drawn, carrying the particular exhaustion of a man whose heart had already warned him once that it was failing. And he stopped laughing. "Fine," Damien said. "I'll find someone." He didn't intend to take it seriously. In fact, he intended to find the most inconvenient, unsuitable woman he could locate, marry her quickly and quietly, and prove to his father, in the petulant, self-defeating logic that had governed most of his adult decisions, that arranged obedience could look exactly like rebellion, if you performed it well enough. He found her at a diner 3 blocks from the harbor, at 2 in the morning, after a night he didn't remember clearly enough to be proud of. She was behind the counter, apron stained with coffee, dark circles under her eyes that spoke of double shifts stacked on double shifts. When Damien, drunk, reckless, looking for exactly the kind of woman his father would never approve of, asked her name with the lazy arrogance of a man used to being answered immediately, she looked at him for a long moment and said nothing at all. "I asked you a question," Damien said. "I heard you," the woman answered. "I'm deciding whether you deserve an answer." Something about the flat, unimpressed calm in her voice cut through the fog of his bad night more sharply than anything had in years. Nobody spoke to Damien Cross like that. Nobody who valued their job, their safety. Their standing in a city where his family's name opened and closed doors at will. "Sophia," she said finally, sliding his coffee across the counter without being asked. "And you look like a man who should go home before he does something he'll regret." "I'm already regretting several things," Damien said. "What's one more?" He came back the next night. And the next. He told himself each time he was simply killing hours he didn't want to spend anywhere else. But the truth was, Sophia Reyes was the only person in his entire life who spoke to him as though his name meant absolutely nothing. And something in Damien, starved for exactly that kind of honesty without ever realizing he'd been starving, kept coming back for more of it. By the end of the second week, half drunk on the particular thrill of doing something his father would find genuinely appalling, Damien asked her to marry him. Sophia laughed in his face. "You don't know the first thing about me. I know you're the last woman on earth my father would ever choose," Damien said. "That's exactly the point." Sophia studied him for a long moment, longer than he expected, longer than the offer deserved. Something careful and calculating moved behind her tired eyes, something Damien, arrogant and self-absorbed as he was, mistook entirely for hesitation instead of what it actually was. "Fine," she said finally. "I'll marry you, Damien Cross. But you should know, you're not the only one in this arrangement who's about to get something they didn't expect." He laughed at that too, certain he understood the joke better than she did. He would not laugh again for a very long time. The wedding happened fast, 3 weeks from proposal to altar. Exactly the reckless, dumb-in-the-eye timeline Damien had wanted, engineered specifically to leave his father no time to investigate the bride before the ring was already on her finger. Antonio Cross sat in the front row of that ceremony with a face carved from stone, watching his only son marry a woman with no family anyone recognized, no dowry, no name that opened a single door in their world. He said nothing at all, until the reception when he pulled Damien aside near the bar, his grip on Damien's arm gentler than his tone. "You did this despite me," Antonio said. "It wasn't a question." "I did this because you told me to marry," Damien said. "I married." "You married a diner waitress to prove a point," Antonio said. "And in doing so you may have just handed every family in this city a reason to believe the Cross name means nothing anymore, that an heir with no discipline will marry anyone, for any reason, the moment his father asks him to grow up." He looked past Damien's shoulder to where Sophia stood near the windows, in a simple ivory dress that had clearly been altered rather than made, quiet and composed amid a room full of whispering strangers who had already decided, before she'd said a single word to any of them, exactly what kind of woman she was. "I hope for your sake, that she's worth what this is going to cost you." Damien didn't answer. He was watching Sophia too. And for the first time since the diner, he found himself uncertain whether he'd won an argument with his father, or simply lost something he hadn't understood he was risking at all. The mockery started before the cake was even cut. Damien heard it in fragments, a cousin's wife murmuring behind a napkin about diner money, a business associate's low laugh about how far the Cross standards had fallen, a woman from a rival family wondering loudly, to no one in particular, whether Damien had married her over a lost bet. Sophia heard all of it too. Damien watched her hear it, watched the careful, composed stillness in her face as she absorbed insult after insult from strangers who would never have dared speak to her that way if they'd known anything real about her at all. And something unfamiliar and uncomfortable began to itch beneath his ribs. It took him 3 days into the marriage to notice that his new wife never once seemed rattled by any of it. "They think you're an idiot," he said one evening, watching her methodically work through a stack of mail at the small desk in what had once been his private study. His study, he corrected himself, though it no longer entirely felt that way with her in it. "The whole family thinks I married a fool because I couldn't be bothered to find someone with actual standing." "Does that bother you?" Sophia asked, not looking up from the mail. "What they think?" "It bothers me that you don't seem bothered." Sophia finally looked up, something unreadable and faintly amused behind her tired, steady eyes. "I've survived worse than a room full of rich people whispering about my apron, Damien. Give it time." It was the way she said it, not defensive, not wounded, almost bored. The tone of someone who had genuinely weathered circumstances that made a ballroom full of insults feel trivial. And it made Damien actually stop and look at his wife properly for the first time since the diner. He noticed things he hadn't bothered to notice in 3 weeks of arrogant courtship. The precise, economical way she moved through a room, always aware of every exit, every person, every angle, the way soldiers moved, not waitresses. The calluses on her hands that had nothing to do with carrying coffee pots. The thin, old scar along her forearm that she never explained, and that he'd never thought to ask about, too absorbed in his own rebellion to wonder what kind of life left a mark like that. And the locked drawer in the small desk she'd claimed as her own, one she only opened when she believed she was alone. 3 weeks into a marriage he'd entered as a joke, Damien found himself standing outside that drawer one night, listening to the careful click of a key he had never seen before. He should have walked away. Standing in that darkened hallway, he told himself whatever was in that drawer was almost certainly nothing. Old letters, private grief, the ordinary secrets any person had every right to keep. Instead, 3 nights later, while Sophia was out on some vague errand she'd barely mentioned, gone nearly 4 hours in a city where even Damien's own men couldn't tell him where she'd gone, He picked the lock himself with the quiet, practiced skill of a man who'd grown up around locks meant to keep him out of exactly this kind of trouble. Inside, beneath a false bottom clearly installed by someone who understood exactly how thoroughly a room could be searched, Damien found a single folder. He opened it expecting old photographs, forgotten letters, the ordinary detritus of a hidden life. What he found instead was a federal identification badge with Sophia's photo on it, under a name that was not Sofia Reyes at all. The badge read, Special Agent Elena Vasquez, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Organized Crime Division. Damien stood frozen in the dim light of his own study, staring at his wife's face beneath a name he had never once heard her use, feeling the entire foundation of the last 3 weeks tilt sideways beneath him. Beneath the badge lay surveillance photographs. His own father meeting a shipping contact at the harbor. Enzo Marchetti, one of Antonio's oldest lieutenants, exchanging an envelope outside a restaurant Damien recognized. And his own face, younger, at a family gathering 2 years earlier, circled in red ink, with a date and a case file number scrawled beside it. His hands weren't steady when he closed the folder. He heard the front door open 40 minutes later. Heard Sophia's, Elena's, footsteps in the hallway unhurried, the same calm rhythm he'd learned in 3 weeks to associate with a woman who had never once, in all that time, seemed genuinely afraid of anything in his world. He was sitting in the dark of the study when she walked in and found the folder open on the desk. Every trace of exhaustion dropped out of her face the instant she saw it, replaced by something colder, sharper, entirely unfamiliar. "You went through my things," she said quietly. "You're FBI," Damien said. It wasn't a question either. Elena. He couldn't yet make himself think of her as anyone else, though he understood, distantly, that Sofia Reyes had never existed at all, closed the study door behind her and crossed the room slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. "How long?" Damien said. "How long have you been watching my family?" 3 years, Elena said. There was no point denying it now. "I've been building a case against your father's shipping operation for 3 years. Money laundering primarily. Though we suspect it runs into trafficking routes we haven't fully mapped yet." She paused. "And the diner wasn't random. I've worked that counter for 6 months. I knew you drank there when you wanted to disappear from your own life for a night. I knew eventually you'd walk in drunk enough to do something reckless." Her jaw tightened, the first crack in her composure Damien had seen since the wedding. "I didn't expect the reckless thing to be a marriage proposal. That wasn't part of the plan." "So what was the plan?" Damien said, his voice rising despite himself. "Get close to me, use me to get inside my father's operation?" "Yes," Elena said flatly, no apology in it at all. "That was exactly the plan. I won't lie to you about that. Not now that you already know." Something in Damien's chest went cold and tight, a feeling he didn't have a name for yet, somewhere between betrayal and a strange, unwilling respect for the sheer, unblinking honesty of her answer. "Then everything," he said slowly. "Every conversation. Every night you stayed late talking to me instead of walking away. All of it was what? Surveillance." "Some of it started that way," Elena said. And for the first time, something uncertain moved behind her eyes. "I won't pretend otherwise. But Damien." "Don't," he said. "Don't tell me it became something else. That's exactly what a federal agent would say to keep an asset compliant." Elena's expression hardened again, quick and sharp. "You want to know what I actually think of you, Damien Cross? I think you spent 31 years being the most spoiled, entitled man in a family full of dangerous men, coasting on a name you never earned. I think you married me on a drunken whim specifically because you knew it would humiliate your father, without once considering what it might cost the woman standing next to you at that altar." She stepped closer and Damien, despite everything, didn't step back. "And I also think that in 3 weeks of watching you up close in your own house with your guard down in ways you clearly never intended, you are not actually the man that reputation describes. Which is the single most inconvenient discovery I've made in 3 years of building this case." Damien stared at her, the folder still open on the desk between them, and found himself unable, for the first time since the diner, to summon a single sharp or dismissive response. "What happens now?" he said quietly. "That," Elena said, "depends entirely on what you do in the next 5 minutes." Because I have 3 years of evidence against your father sitting in a federal building across the city, Damien. And I have a husband who just found out his wife has been lying to him since the moment they met. She held his gaze steady, unflinching. You can call your father's men right now, tell them everything, and I disappear tonight, one way or another. Or you can tell me exactly how much you already suspected about what he's building this empire on. Because I don't think after 3 weeks in this house, that you're quite as naive about your own family as you've spent your whole life pretending to be. Damien sat back slowly, the folder still open between them, and for a long moment said nothing at all. Because the honest answer to her question was one he had never spoken aloud to anyone. Not his father, not his sisters, not the string of women he'd dated specifically, because they never asked him anything real. I've known something was wrong since I was 19, he said finally. I found a set of ledgers in my father's office that didn't match anything he ever told me about the shipping business. I asked him about it once. Only once. He looked down at his own hands and told me some questions get good sons killed, and some questions get bad sons disowned, and he suggested I decide quickly which one I wanted to be. And you decided, Elena said quietly, to be neither. To be so useless and reckless that nobody would ever expect you to actually understand what you were part of. Damien's jaw tightened at how precisely she'd named it, a truth he had never once said out loud, not even to himself, dressed up for over a decade as simple spoiled indifference instead of what it actually was. It was easier, he admitted, to be the family joke than to be the man who knew and did nothing. Elena studied him for a long moment, something shifting behind her careful, guarded expression. Not quite trust, not yet. But the recalculation of a woman who had walked into this marriage with one theory of her target, and was now rapidly revising it. Your father's operation runs deeper than shipping fraud, she said slowly, choosing her words now with a different kind of care. Enzo Marchetti has been moving people through the same ports your father uses for cargo. Not drugs, Damien. Human trafficking. Dressed up in manifests that make it look like nothing more than a labor contract violation, if anyone ever looks too closely. The color drained slowly from Damien's face. My father knows about this? Your father, Elena said, signs off on every shipment personally. I have 3 years of paper trail that says he's known from the beginning. Damien stood abruptly, crossing to the window, staring out at the dark lawn where 20 years ago he'd learned to ride a bike while his father watched from this exact study, with an expression Damien had always read, wrongly, as simple pride. I want to help you, he said without turning around. Damien, I'm not asking for your permission, Elena said. He turned back to face her, something new and hard settling into his voice, something that hadn't been there in the diner, hadn't been there at the altar, hadn't been there through 3 weeks of reckless performative rebellion. I've spent 31 years pretending not to know because knowing meant choosing, and I was a coward about which choice to make. I'm done being a coward, Elena. If my father has built this empire on trafficking children through his shipping routes, I want it stopped, whatever that costs me. Elena watched him for a long moment, weighing exactly how much of this sudden conviction she could actually trust from a man who had lied about his own nature for over a decade. Even to himself. If you help me, she said finally. He doesn't walk away from this. Not lucky. More likely, Damien. A man like your father doesn't survive a federal indictment long enough to see a courtroom. Enzo Marchetti and the others named in this case will assume he's already talking the moment word gets out an investigation is closing in. Men like that don't wait around to find out if it's true. Damien absorbed this in silence, the weight of it settling into his chest slower than he expected. Grief arriving for a man he hadn't yet lost. For a childhood built on a foundation he'd spent 31 years refusing to examine too closely. I understand, he said finally. I'm still asking. Then I need something concrete, Elena said. Not conviction, Damien, evidence. Access to the shipping ledgers your father keeps separate from the ones he shows the accountants. Access to whatever internal communication exists between him and Enzo about the routes. I can't build a federal case on a husband's change of heart. I need paper. I know where he keeps the real ledgers, Damien said. I've known since I was 19. I just never had a reason strong enough to actually go looking. Elena's expression shifted, something almost like the beginning of real trust moving behind her careful eyes. You have one now. Took 4 days. Damien moved through his father's house with a caution he'd never once exercised in 31 years of careless living, waiting for the narrow window every Thursday evening when Antonio met privately with his accountant and the house staff cleared out for the housekeeper's shift change. A 15-minute gap Damien had never noticed until he needed it, and one Elena had apparently mapped down to the second, months earlier. The ledgers were exactly where 19-year-old Damien had glimpsed them once and never looked again, behind a false panel in his father's private safe. The combination was something Damien had memorized as a teenager, and never once considered using against the man who taught it to him. He photographed 40 pages with a small camera Elena had given him, his hand steadier than he expected, some new and unfamiliar version of himself emerging in the quiet, careful work of finally choosing a side. He was 3 pages from finished when the study door opened behind him. I wondered, Antonio Cross said quietly, how long it would take you to find your way back to that safe. Damien turned slowly, the camera still in his hand, and found his father standing in the doorway, not with rage but with something far more unsettling. A kind of tired, resigned understanding, as though this exact moment had lived in the back of Antonio's mind for over a decade, waiting patiently for its turn to arrive. You knew, Damien said. You knew I found the first set of ledgers when I was 19. I've known everything about you your entire life, Antonio said. I knew you'd marry that woman the moment you brought her home out of spite, thinking you were rebelling against me. I even suspected within a week that she wasn't quite what she claimed to be. Federal agents have a particular stillness about them, Damien. Once you've spent 40 years learning to spot it. He walked slowly into the room and Damien, watching him, saw for the first time how genuinely exhausted his father looked. How much closer to the end of something he actually was. I let it happen anyway. Do you know why? Damien said nothing, the camera heavy and damning in his hand. Because I am tired, Antonio said, of being the only crossman willing to carry what this family actually is. I built this empire out of nothing, and I built it dirty, because the alternative 40 years ago was watching my own family starve in a city that never once offered me anything clean to build with instead. He stopped a few feet away, looking at his son with an expression Damien had never once seen on his father's face in 31 years, something that might have been relief. I am too old and too tired and too sick to end this myself, Damien. I think some part of me married you off recklessly, hoping exactly this would happen, that you'd find someone honest enough to force the ending I never had the courage to choose on my own. You wanted this, Damien said slowly, disbelief moving through him. I wanted an ending, Antonio said. I did not particularly care which one arrived, as long as it finally came. He looked at the camera in Damien's hand. Finish what you started. I won't stop you. And I won't run. I've spent 40 years running from what I built. I find now that I'm simply tired of running. Damien didn't sleep that night. He sat instead in the quiet dark of his father's study long after Antonio had gone upstairs, the photographed ledger pages already transferred to Elena's secure line, the case that would end his family's empire now moving forward with a momentum neither of them could stop, even if they wanted to. He found Elena in the kitchen just past dawn, the same tired, watchful stillness in her face he'd first mistaken at the diner for simple exhaustion. He knew, Damien said, sitting across from her. My father. He's known for years this would eventually happen. He didn't fight me for the ledgers. He said he was tired of running from what he built. Elena studied him carefully. And you? How are you, Damien, after handing over evidence that will likely end your father's life one way or another? I don't know yet, Damien admitted, and the honesty of it surprised him. 3 weeks ago, he would have deflected with a joke, a shrug, the careless performance he'd spent a decade perfecting. I think I'll grieve a father I never actually had, and mourn the version of him I wanted to believe in. And neither of those things will be the same as missing the man who actually existed. Something in Elena's expression softened, unguarded for the first time since he'd found that folder. For what it's worth, she said quietly, I wasn't lying about everything. The plan started as surveillance. It didn't stay that way. Prove it, Damien said, echoing without quite meaning to, the exact words she'd used against him days earlier. Elena almost smiled. I turned down 2 chances to extract myself from this marriage in the last 3 weeks. My supervisor offered both times. I said no both times, and I told myself it was because the case needed more time. She looked at him directly. It wasn't entirely that. The federal case moved fast once Elena's evidence went through proper channels. Antonio Cross was indicted within the month and, true to his own quiet prediction, did not survive to see a courtroom. A heart that had already warned him once finally gave out 3 weeks into house arrest, in a bed in the same estate where he'd raised a son he'd spent 30 years failing to prepare for anything real. Enzo Marchetti and 4 other lieutenants were arrested within days of the ledger's surfacing, the trafficking routes dismantled by a federal task force that moved with the kind of speed only 3 years of careful, patient groundwork could buy. Damien testified, publicly completely burning down whatever remained of the Cross family standing in a single afternoon in a federal courtroom. And standing at that podium, he found he felt something closer to relief than the grief he'd braced himself for. The empire did not survive him. He made sure of that himself, liquidating what legitimate assets remained and refusing point-blank every offer from remaining associates, hoping he'd simply step into his father's chair and continue business as it had always been conducted. You could have kept all of it, Damien, one of his father's old lieutenants told him bitterly, the week before the last of the Cross holdings were sold off. The name still means something in this city. You didn't have to burn it to the ground just because you finally grew a conscience. That's exactly why I did, Damien said. Because I finally understood what the name actually meant. 1 year later, Damien Cross, no longer spoiled, no longer performing carelessness as a shield against the truth he'd spent a decade avoiding, stood in a small apartment 2 boroughs from the estate he'd sold, watching his wife, Elena Vasquez, review case files at a kitchen table considerably smaller, and considerably more honest, than anything his family had ever owned. Regrets? She asked, without looking up, the same dry, unimpressed tone she'd used on him at the diner counter over a year ago. 1, Damien said, sitting across from her. I regret that it took me 31 years, and a woman lying to my face in every possible way, to finally become a man worth being married to. Elena looked up then, something warm and unguarded moving across her face. A look she'd never once worn in that first cold, mocking ballroom, where an entire city had laughed at a marriage they believed was a joke. For what it's worth, she said, I don't regret marrying the man everyone thought I'd settled for. They thought you were marrying beneath your station, Damien said. I was, Elena said, for about 3 weeks. Then you actually became someone worth the trouble. Outside the small apartment window, the city moved on the way cities always did, indifferent to empires that rose and fell within them. And Damien Cross, stripped of a name that had once opened every door in New York and closed just as many, found that he had never, in his entire spoiled, careless life, felt more like exactly the man he was supposed to become. Some marriages start as a joke. The ones worth keeping become something else entirely, once both people stop pretending to be who everyone else expected them to be. Would you have forgiven Elena the way Damien did, knowing everything she'd lied about?